base of audience, audience users, audience members to funnel news into their web environments. I mean, it sort of attacks the sort of distribution and finance models that newspapers are having. I mean, how do you, if you have to consider, well, I need to spend X amount of dollars in a budget, my advertising revenues are down, how do I communicate to these people who are tuning out? Do I put more money into promotion and advertising? Should I just basically take my newspaper and put it up on the web? And I think those are not the targeted discussions that we should be having. I think that there's a slightly different twist on the discussion we should be having.
I admire your attempt to get consensus, but I've seen some of your work and I've seen some of Fariah's work, and much of it would give the big one to many people in this audience. You've taken very different approaches to presenting.
Yeah, but this audience isn't, I mean, for this, a lot of the stuff that you've seen, this audience is not that particular target demographic that I'm trying to reach. I mean, I do work, and certainly I think, if we consider what Fariah's done on CNN, there's definitely stuff that we've both done that speak to this audience. I think it's just a question of context. If I'm going to make a pop culture CD-ROM magazine that I'm trying to target to an 18 to 25 male audience, yeah, there's a very specific content direction I'm going to take. But if I'm trying to position content to a male 25 to 45 consumer electronics buying audience, believe me, I'm going to take a very different approach in how I speak to them and what kind of content I build for them.
What I get out of that is audience equals content.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it does.
Absolutely.
And I'm glad you brought up CNN because, I mean, I wear a lot of different hats. I write for Time magazine, which obviously has a very broad general audience paper. I write op-eds sometimes, but I have my website where I'm speaking generally. I envision the reader as someone who's something like me, young, possibly black, possibly a woman, interested in pop music and pop culture. When I go on CNN, I'm talking about inside the Beltway politics, something that people who read my website may or may not care about, but when I speak on CNN, I definitely do it in a different tone than when I talk about politics on my website. And I also write for a magazine called Vibe, which is a very well-respected music publication which deals with the hip-hop industry, but also does political stories, which I'm in charge of. And for each of those audiences, the tone that I take is different, and the choice of stories is different. For example, in the past stories we've done for Vibe, in the political section, we've done workfare, because we're talking to a young urban audience, and workfare is going to impact them. We talked about the Amnesty International reports on police brutality, because a young urban audience cares about that. In New York City, just recently, you had another a case where a young kid was shot in the back, and that causes a lot of controversy because it gets heavily into city politics. We talk about stories that should be front page stories, and often are front page stories in America's newspapers, but we do it in a way that speaks to this audience. So I think one thing that I want to transmit is that even though we can speak differently to different audiences, it doesn't mean that you are A, pandering, or B, should be patronizing. You can cover tough stories, you can cover important stories, but you do have to play to your audience. I think everyone does. The whole question, I mean, because I'm not, I think that as much as I love my website, that's certainly not my primary news identification. I mean, I started out at Newsweek, working traditional news magazine print stories, and then went to MTV News, and then went to CNN. So I've had sort of this interesting, varied experience. And at MTV, that is a perfect example of a non-news company trying to make that transition.
Ted?
I kind of look at this new medium as it's oxygen. Get used to it. This is not about niches. This is not about edginess. This is a mass medium in the development. New York Times is one of our partners. We support one another. We're going to have more subscribers on AOL in New York City in 6 months than the New York Times does. That's, when we first started, we were much smaller, was 3 years ago. We had less than 1 million people. And as you know, we have 8 million people paying us $20 a month. And we'll have more subscribers in New York City than the New York Times. Now, fortunately for the New York Times, they get it. They embrace it. They're doing a great paper. They're doing At Times. They're doing, www.times.com. They're working with us to thread their content throughout. We also acquired Total New York for New York City, for digital cities. And so we want to work with newspapers for the talent. We'll work with you with the brands. But this isn't a fight. This has happened. And it is. It's oxygen. Get used to it.
I sort of disagree with that in a sense, in that I certainly appreciate all the wonderful things that the online world has brought to our business and our culture and our personal lives. But nonetheless, I find it very interesting that the folks over on the left-hand side, they keep coming back to newspapers again and again. And I think it's the reason they keep coming back, as most of the people in this room would attest to, is that there's something about what we do as journalists that's unique. And it always will be unique. And so long as we are willing and able to change tools and to discuss new idioms and new ways of presenting what we uniquely do to different and new markets, I think there'll always be a wonderful future for newspapers.
Could I give one statistic?
Well, one final thing is, in the old days, newspapers competed vigorously. I worked in a lot of metro markets too, Dallas, Miami, Detroit, and we used to compete against one another. Now, in many cases, there's a single newspaper in major markets, and now it's simply a different kind of competition. And in fact, the competition is sitting right over there, and it's worthy, noble, tough competition. But I think you'll find that the things you're saying are the things we'll be doing to augment and supplement our strengths with your strengths. And I think that is what will make us the prime purveyor of information and news in the future.
Quickly, Ted.
1,100 information providers on AOL. Every 6 months we do audits and votes on favorite areas, most used areas, called Members' Choice Awards. The one that just finished, of the 50 that were chosen, 17 were brand new brands. Didn't exist, no one knew who they were brand new brands. There was one newspaper on that list, and my belief is that 6 months from now there may be no newspapers on that list. That's a significant slice. If 10 million people are voting, what are the most useful, sought-after areas? And there's no newspapers on that list. That's a significant statistic.
Ron Martin, one of the challenges that we've faced over the last 40 years is we've attempted to be one size fits all for our entire community. You've done some things to try to break out of that. First of all, do you think we have tried to be one size fits all? And talk about your attempts to get at particular audiences.
Well, I think we have tried, and we've needed to try and still, I think, continue to need to be, as to the degree we can in our communities, a mass deliverer of information. And I think that that's a challenge for us, and it's one that we can't easily give up. I think that to say, let's just adopt an attitude and let's turn our baseball cap on backwards and wear baggy pants, that's not us.
Would you pay to see that? Show of hands.
Well, I think that we need to keep in mind who we are, what we're trying to do, and so on, and to do those things that we can do best. Do those things and not get too distracted by the others. But at the same time, I think there can be attitudes and separate voices, many separate voices, speaking to lots of different constituencies within our broad newspaper that we deliver. And we ought to look for more ways to present different kinds of voices.
You've used that expression, what we do best, a couple of times. Can you go with that just a second?
Well, we know how to report. We know how to gather information. We know how to organize and present information in a way that's coherent. I mean, you turn to America on Hold, and when you finally get on, eventually...
Now we got it going.
You don't know what you're going to get. You don't know when you're going to get it. And I think that there's going to continue to be a value somewhere for somebody to organize this information and to say, this is what it all adds up to. That's what we can do.
Well, I think it gets back to your word, indispensability. And what I hear Ted saying is that the the Microsofts of the world will become journalists. Well, if they become journalists, then perhaps they will be indispensable and we won't, or we will both be indispensable. But I think that the issue is is our ability to get in there, whether it's within the context of a newspaper or whatever form we're delivering it in. What we basically have, our biggest thing we've got going for us is our ability to gather and deliver that kind of local information. If Microsoft wants to do it and can do it like we can do it, then we may not be indispensable. But that's where I think our indispensability lies right
But
now.
Diane, with the circulation and penetration numbers we face, can we really legitimately make the argument we're indispensable?
Well, I go back to my belief that we have to look at ourselves as institutions. I think that we can make ourselves more indispensable by giving people more choices. We've said to folks, look, you're going to get this on paper and you're going to get it delivered at your doorstep at 6:30 in the morning, and we're sorry if that doesn't accommodate your lifestyle. And I think what's happening is technology is allowing us to give our communities more choices. So if they want to get the paper and turn on SNN and log into News Coast, great, they can do that. What I think is going to happen for us is, because what we sell is credibility, we will ultimately prevail. I really believe that. The issue for us is that our credibility is diminishing, and we've seen that in study after study, and that's why the project that Sandy Rowe and Ed Seaton are planning is so critical, because if we don't rebuild our credibility, then I do worry about our long-term future.
And the interesting thing with that is that the credibility erosion comes in some people's minds in terms of attitude. And so you've got this incredible clash between the desire to have attitude and passion and all these things that you want to have in this information, and then the erosion of credibility when we bring it.
Regina?
Fry and I were talking about this before. Whenever we sort of have these discussions, and that the conversation begins to turn towards the younger generation, how do we reach them? The use of the term attitude, which for me is usually when I get my gun, you know, is the word that keeps on popping up, and it's such a misused application of the word. I think what young people are looking for is not just the injection of, you know, the sort of turned around baseball hat and big baggy pants and pop culture. I think if you look at some of the viewing patterns of young people, especially on the web, you know, they are actually looking for news sources, just not the kind of news sources that I think most people in this audience would recognize as traditional news. And I think one of the other things, I mean, speaking to the point of being institutions, if we begin to really think in terms of the internet or digital media in general as being like oxygen, I mean, the internet time is like dog years. I mean, we move really, really quickly, and I think institutions move generally pretty slowly. And if you look at what's happening in terms of the growth of new sites that are catering towards a younger audience, trying to speak to them and trying to deliver news and content and other types of information to them, we're moving at a much faster pace than any of these larger, more sort of conventional news delivery systems are moving. And I think that, you know, maybe one of the ways in which people can begin to have a meaningful dialogue about this is to really analyze, you know, how do they look at younger audiences, and how quickly are they moving towards trying to reach them in a meaningful way?
I hope that they continue to think that way, because in doing so, I think it'll more or less blind them to the real strengths that they're facing over on the so-called newspaper side. I think there are considerable strengths and positives about newspapers, particularly as they learn and grow and adapt the tactics and strategies and all the principles that exist over on the electronic digital side. And it's only a matter of time until one day I think you're going to wake up and realize, my God, you know, we missed the boat. They were right all along. It just took them a little longer to get there.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, it's just interesting to me how adversarial this has become. I mean, it's not like we're at each other's throats, but there is...
I love it.
No, but, you know...
You told us to do
There is. There's a lot of...
My dream is being fulfilled.
There there's a lot of fear here, and there's a lot of tension, and I think that's because, I mean, the good side is that everybody here is passionate about the news and passionate about delivering content, whatever we see as content, but we've kind of misplaced our tension, our anger, our desire to make things better. I think we're talking about competing between mediums and competing between companies as opposed to competing with ourselves to reach an audience. And I want to bring up some specifics about newspapers as they relate to young adults. I did this project at the Media Studies Center, part of the Freedom Forum, on how young adults are portrayed by the news and how they perceive the news. We did a bunch of Roper polls and asked some very specific questions about what young adults want from newspapers. And we found that for the most part, the good news is that for the most part they want roughly the same type of content as older adults. They tend to want more specific information on topics they care about particularly, which could be everything from computers to jobs. But the whole problem is they sort of see the news as something which is too often vague, not specific enough. When you talk about business, they like career information much more than they like sort of vague, hog futures up 5%. If you talk about the strengths of newspapers, you talk about, as you said, credibility, but also being able to deliver real information to the audience. And I think when we talk about the future of newspapers, we talk about the declining and diminishing audience, maybe what we're talking about is the inability to really reach, I'll make one quick analogy before I stop. When we talk about elections, I spend a lot of time analyzing politics, we talk about people who win and lose. Obviously, it's very important. But we don't often think about the non-voting population in relation to the winners and losers. When we talk about on a presidential level, half of the people not voting, on midterm elections, 3/4 of Americans sometimes not voting, we're talking about huge untapped resources in a political sense. I think we need to think that way about the newspaper audience and about the news audience in general.
Ron, Fry says this is getting adversarial. Yet we have critics like your old buddy and mine, John Katz, who in his new book, Virtuous Reality, says that people in this room and our newspapers hate the young. And he kind of thinks you ought to put your cap on backwards and thinks that we're missing that completely. What are your thoughts?
I don't agree with that at all. I think we...
First time you and John disagreed, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think John overstates things sometimes. No, I think that we do not hate the young at all. And I think that what we've been, he may be mistaking this. I mean, to write about William Bennett and all of his campaigns and so on, and to try to do it in a relatively straightforward, objective kind of way. Maybe he thinks we're endorsing that, we're buying into that, and so on. I don't think. I think that's a big story. What's going on, the fight over TV ratings and how you label them, all that sort of thing. We have to cover that kind of thing. Doesn't mean that we're saying, so this is the way it ought to be, that we're in favor of it.
Bill Bass, referee a little bit. What are you hearing? What are you seeing?
It's interesting because when you talk about newspapers presenting a complete package, but if I go through about any of your all's newspapers and I start looking through and I say, what got created locally and how much of this stuff is packaged from other people, the amount of local stuff that gets created is vanishingly small. You take out the wire service stories, you take out the stock tables, you take out all the classified ads, real estate and things like that, and what's left that you people in this room deliver is really a small part of the entire package. And a lot of that package is easier to receive online. So I can go online and get my stock quotes. I have Pointcast, which is a little system that delivers stock quotes to your computer. It's free.
Irritating, you forgot that.
It's really interesting. You end up with this bimodal distribution of people either love it or hate it. And so if it's floating on their screens, they hate it. But about 1.5 million people love it and have it on their screens in a year. So there are enough that love it that make it important. And it's constantly feeding you real-time stock quotes, essentially real-time. I mean, definitely not until May. It's 15-minute delay, so it's much more real-time than tomorrow. But you get real estate. The realtors are putting up all their homes on the internet. So now people are now disaggregating their use and are going to these best-of-breed sites. And the problem that you run into with that is the newspapers are always going to be better at doing news than America Online, than Microsoft, and the rest of these people. There's no question about that. But that's kind of not going to matter because so many people are now going to be getting a lot of the other information in the paper from other places that they're not going to be willing to pay what they're getting for this total package. They're not going to want to pony up 50 cents.
That's interesting that you say newspapers are always going to be best at news. Do we really have news in this 24-hour world that you're talking about, Ted? Is what newspapers have, is it news?
I go back to, I don't think about content, I don't think about newspapers. I think about talent, streams of information, context. In the future, editors are going to be bartenders. That's what I think. I know that's a terrible thing to say, in that what the role of a editor will be social media. It'll be, I'm bringing you into a place, into a bar. I'm going to give you the news. I'm going to bring other people around that will talk to you about the news. I'll find dissenting voices, and I'll package that up for you. That's a great new position and job.
Well, that's a lousy description of what a society ought to be, I think. I think that look at the Pulitzer Prizes and look at what the Seattle Times did with its investigation of the 747 rudders and so on. How the hell is that going to happen on the internet? I mean, that's a reporter. I mean, I don't know those people, but it's a reporter who took months working on a story like that when the biggest industry in town, Boeing, was saying this guy is not credible, the paper's irresponsible, all those things. He produced wonderful work that's going to have major impact on all of us. Now, how does that stuff happen online if we just pretend we're bartenders?
Well, let me just point out the San Jose Mercury story on the CIA Contra crack, association. A lot of people attacked that story, but even the Columbia Journalism Review came out and said, places like the Post spent more time attacking a story that had some fundamental truthful points than they did trying to figure out what was going on. The only way people who were interested in that story could actually find out even the basics was to go to the website, because that was maintained. The San Jose Mercury News is not a nationally distributed newspaper. I logged on, I looked at their story, I read, I read supplementary publications from other places. I think that it's not that the web is going to create news content as much as it is going to be a funnel for distributing the best work of local journalists nationally.
Yeah, I guess I'm concerned, though, that if we don't have the advertising base, the revenue base, to support somebody spending months doing that kind of investigation, which can then be talked about on the web, how's it going to happen?
Diane?
We're arguing over means of distribution,
Right.
and we don't need to. Public service journalism can be performed on any platform. I think that newspapers are better, are going to continue to be better at certain things, but increasingly we will start using our websites for certain things, and I think increasingly a lot of newspaper organizations will use TV channels for certain things, and I think that's the key. I am extremely impressed by these two young women, but they are going after a very different audience than I am. Their audience is national. Mine is not. Mine is local. I am grateful if I can get some young people. Increasingly, they're tuning in to SNN, and I hope we'll use News Coast, which is brand new and not real good yet. But I think they'll come to us if, as Regina said, if they have an interest in the community, they will come to us and they'll choose the means of distribution that fits their lifestyle the best. As they get older, they may want another form of distribution. As they get older, they may increasingly turn to the newspaper. I think needs, the folks that you're reaching now as they get older may start, well, what you're doing, Regina, logging into the New York Times site first. We're just going after different markets.
But I'm not sure that that's exactly what we're talking about in terms of Microsoft. I don't know if that is where they're going in terms of setting up their local news gathering and provision sources. I don't think that's just a question of delivery and how you're doing it. I think it's a question of journalism.
No, they want your classified business.
Right.
Well,
It's
a
not
pretty
about
simple
news delivery
equation.
with MSN. What they want to do is they want to create basically a regional environment through which people can access service-based information as opposed to news. I mean, to do a story on, to do a story that requires months and months of careful research, that is not what these sidewalk sites are going to be about.
not
These
be
sidewalk
right
sites
now.
are going to be about restaurant reviews and classified ads and getting down to hardcore service information that people will access that site for specifically. With regards to news, I mean, that can take another format.
Mary Jo, you used a magic word, journalism. Everybody in this room thinks they know what that means. What do you mean when you used journalism? I think that's where Ron was going to.
I'm jumping off of Ron. There's another component there. It's higher. It's higher moral values. Not moral. That's the wrong word. It is a cause.
Let's now sing Kumbaya. but isn't that a real issue for you, Ted, that journalism is a higher moral, spiritual thing?
I think it's a wonderful calling, and I think it's terrific, but
But you can't make any money off it.
No, but you don't make any money off it either, right? I mean, and what I think is happening here, well, let's be frank, in the business model of the newspapers, if 10% of the classified revenues move someplace else, many of the newspapers in this association go from being profitable to being unprofitable. Pages would be less, editorial coverage would be less. You're in a real critical time because circulation is not growing, but ad rates are increasing. That's not ultimately the best business case. And we just dismissed Pointcast, and they went from 0 to almost 2 million customers in 13 months.
Well, there's no question that what he's saying is true, that we are, in some respects, an industry under siege. But it's also quite true that the greatest changes, or I hate to use the P word, but the greatest paradigm shifts frequently occur when you do find a group or an industry or whatever under siege and under stress, just like an oyster produces the finest pearls when there's an irritant. And frankly, I think that the online new media is an irritant, but it's a positive irritant. It's an irritant that we'll all learn from and embrace, and in time, given our core strength, which is journalism and credibility within the public, it'll produce a big winner for all of us, and it doesn't necessarily discredit or preclude anything that happens in other areas of news gathering.
I want to go back to the bartender concept.
Publisher, though, say that the core competencies of a newspaper is circulation, development, and understanding, the demographic, and ad sales, and classified sales, and editorial. That it's those four legs of the stool that make a newspaper what it is as a brand and an entity.
Yeah, community building.
Community building, and that's what I keep saying, that I think that is what we value so incredibly highly in making this medium real. We're not going to, there's not an AOL newsroom where we're writing news. Okay? Microsoft is totally functioning as they see that they can go into an area and that your classified business is at risk. It's cheaper to do self-publishing of classifieds and take it out, and as critical mass emerges in these cities, that's where the risk is for the industry. So my comment is, come to us. We'll work with you.
I want to go back to the bartender concept. Is context king or is content king?
Well, context is king. If I can oversimplify the case to make a point, I think that journalists, we are uniquely positioned and trained to provide context that people crave and need in their daily lives, whereas on the new media side, they're uniquely positioned to provide zillions and zillions more megabytes of information than we possibly can at any one day. Nonetheless, I think we are very much on the side of context, and I'm hearing content over here, and very little about context, and that provides a basis for understanding of important and complicated issues.
Mary Jo?
Journalism. That's journalism. It's the context. I'm with George.
Regina, what about context?
Well, I mean, I don't think that you can have content really that matters to anyone without the context. I mean, if you talk about any distribution medium in which you could have millions of potential competitors, If I can't give a distinct context to my content will be lost. How am I going to, and ultimately, the bottom line behind any of this is it has to make money for somebody somewhere. I mean, unless you are just basically the casual user who wants to create your own website, your own personal website. It's a, you know, it's a